Hello and welcome to Sparky Hobbies. My name is Ben, and today I'm going to go over the deck construction, deck tech of the black Newbie deck that was recently featured in my gameplay tutorial. I designed this deck to basically teach newer players more advanced strategies, like when you'd want to leave mana open, when you want to block, when you want to cast spells and things like that, to make the most out of your your mana and your creatures. So the theme of this deck is revolving around Pump, and this is an enchantment aura that enchants target swamp, and it says enchanted swamp you may pay 2 until end of turn. Enchanted swamp becomes a black 2/2 with the Pump shade like ability, which basically says you may pay any number of black mana to give +1/+1. It's important that newer players realize that this can be used both offensively and defensively, and that there's a difference between activated abilities that require tapped and not require tapped. And of course, if Genju defends Swamp would be put into your graveyard, you may return Genju defends from your graveyard to your hand. It also basically displays sort of the man land abilities. Which is another reason why I put this card in there, because there's plenty of man lands in Magic, and in particular this deck wants to run swamps, not man lands, so it gives a little bit of that extra flavor. So this is the first card of the deck. It's a spell, and it's the only spell in the deck that costs 1. So it doesn't have a very aggressive mana curve per se. But we're going to be looking at this in the terms of like why I built it for basically newer players. This one is an exposure to theme, enchantment auras, and man land. So I will probably keep this one in the deck. Of course, any decent deck you probably should run removal, and of course Terra's classic removal. It also features the word can't be regenerated, so what would that mean, this deck does have some regeneration. Here's another enchantment that features the Pump ability, the Shade ability. It's a good use for a lot of land in later turns if you don't have ways to use up all of your mana. This is actually goes beyond just this deck. If you're going to be playing a very aggro deck, putting in a single Jade Mage or Azura Mage and make the most of your mana at later turns is sometimes the way to do it, and so the Pump ability is similar to that in that effect. This one also will display the fact that the weakness of enchantment creature auras is that if somebody destroys your creature that has an enchantment aura on it, they just got card advantage because they destroyed 2 cards off of 1. So it's important for newer players to realize to learn about card advantage and when to kind of work around it, both the strengths and the weaknesses of when are you going to spend 2 cards to get 1 card off the battlefield or out of an opponent's hand, and when can your opponent use a single card to destroy 2 of your cards and get card advantage off of you. So that'll probably stay in the deck. Again, another creature aura deck, but this one features evasion, and also goes back to the old school keyword fear, and this is what it's based off of. So a good way to introduce somebody to an older keyword. This is the only this is the only equipment in the deck. It's just to feature sort of an equipment, introduce newer players to equipment, and that can only be attached to sorcery speed. One of the nice particular features about this one is that it has the reminder text on there so that everybody sort of remembers that it can only be attached certain times. There are a lot of different ways to do ramping. Cabal Coffers would be one, the land Cabal Coffers. In this one I picked Extra Planar Lens. I have 2 copies of Extra Planar Lens because I want to basically, if there's a cost associated for an additional cost, I really want to display that you can basically use already tapped resources. So in this case it's already a tapped land that you'll want to remove, namely Swamp. If there's another creature that says, as additional cost of spell, sacrifice a creature, if that creature has a tap effect, use the tap effect before you sacrifice him, or attack with that creature, see if he's going to die before you sacrifice him, especially if it's going to be something like an instant. I have another two removals in black, Seal of Doom. Seal of Doom is a different take on the sense that you can play it and then leave it on the board. So it definitely does have a different sort of flavor for removal, and it kind of would also display to a newer player that sometimes you want to keep removal in your keep removal, and sometimes of course you'd use it immediately. So they definitely have to make this choice for Seal of Doom. But Seal of Doom is not very good removal specifically. So I think I'm going to introduce some of my newer players to a different sort of black removal, which is discard. So I'm going to switch out one of the Seals of Doom with Distress. Distress costs one less, so it's a little bit more playable, and target player reveals his hand and you choose a non-land from it. Gives a little bit of extra information to the player also. That could be good or bad. Sometimes, like, if you know too much, you overthink the situation. But it introduces the newer player to a different sort of black removal, and it's not as clunky as Seal of Doom, so I think I'm going to switch that one out. Tanos' Wand is a particular great ad for this deck. Because it makes a creature with power no greater than 2 unblockable. And then it specifically says on it, other effects may be later used to increase that creature's power beyond 2. So Tanos' Wand sort of gives a new player a hint that they might use a creature with a pump effect, such as Nantuko Shade or Genju the Fens. It only has power 2, you make it unblockable with Tanos' Wand, and then you could pump it up through there for extra damage past that. So Tanos' Wand definitely has a timing element in the sense that you would have to use it before you pump up your creature, not afterwards. And Tanos' Wand is clunky. It's not the best. It's not the most mana efficient way to basically make a small creature unblockable until end of turn. There's a lot better ways to do it. But Tanos' Wand needs a home. It's part of my collection. It needs a home, and it's a great part of the newbie ad in the sense that it directly gives a newer player the hint that you can use it, you can pump up the creature's power after the effect. There's a combat trick waiting in Tanos' Wand. I have two sort of game finishing spells based on creatures. One is an instant and has a alternative cost, so it introduces ideas of alternative cost to a player. Also, it's an instant which can be used both on the defensive and offenses after blockers are declared. So if you attack with 3 creatures and your little guy is going to be chump blocked, he's a great position to sacrifice if you want to get through extra damage for the Dark Triumph. The Dance with Shadows is a form of evasion and pump, but it's very costly. It's not very efficient. There are, like, Hideous End is a new print that basically gives creatures Intimidate, but doesn't give the +1/+0. It's also sorcery speed, so I could make that switch out, but I'm going to go ahead and keep it at 5 so that some of the newer players that might play this deck, that I loan this deck out to, might be encouraged to use it when it potentially could have a more beneficial cost, basically a later game when you have more creatures out. But that could be debated. Hideous End might be able to use better with a pump, obviously. So, but those are the two sort of get through for damage, extra little spells. Another big element of getting through for damage. This could also be used as creature removal, which not a lot of players will probably think to use Howl from Beyond as creature removal, and all of the early ones basically had all the early sets usually had forms of creature removal, and Green's Giant Growth was actually sort of meant as a form of alternative creature removal and possible get through for damage. The +3/+3 target creature gets +3/+3, because you'd get in a combat situation, block with a small creature, and make your one guy bigger so that he can kill a larger creature. Howl from Beyond is a particular. I really like it in this particular deck because with the extraplanar lens, it can get through for a lot of damage, and also it makes a newer player think about whether they want to use this particular spell as a form of combat trick creature removal, just like Giant Growth. I have 2 copies in there just to do a switch up, like I in the gameplay. In the gameplay featured, you saw a Howl from Beyond used on a Gravedigger, where somebody blocked the pump creature and the Howl from Beyond came in through for massive amounts of damage with just on the Gravedigger. So it is a combat trick. I have basically the classic Consume Spirit. You may pay X amount of black mana beyond 2 and you do X damage, gain life. I also have the older school Drain Life, which is not as efficient, it's not as friendly, it's not as nice as Consume Spirit, but I kind of wanted to encourage newer players to basically read their cards. So that's for the spells. Pretty heavy mana curve, not the best mana curve for these spells. Also, removal is a little bit light. But it also, sometimes you want to use your Consume Spirits, your Drain Lives for creature removal. So there's definitely some tough choices to be made for newer players when playing this deck, just because there's not as efficient creature removal as possible. There's 23 swamps. And I could do something like Cobble Coffers as an alternative to like Extraplanar Lens or an additional to Extraplanar Lens, but I've decided that I just don't want it to be to get that convoluted. So the mana curve is not the most aggressive on this deck. There are no 1-drops except for Genju the Fens. And let's see here. I'm having a little bit of camera issues. But we see what's going to be the theme of the deck, which is creatures with pump. So both Wicked Akuba and Nantuko Shade cost 2 black. They're power 2s. Nantuko Shade is a 2/1, so it's a little more vulnerable. The Wicked Akuba has to get through for damage before you can pump it, while the Nantuko Shade, of course, is a better card because it can, intimidate your opponent by casting, pumping it up before you attack, and then that player has to decide whether or not they want to just stand in front. The other creature at 2 mana is the Slith Bloodletter. Whenever Slith Bloodletter deals combat damage, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's basically players are encouraged to block it, and it also has Regenerate, so it can be used as a blocker. Introduce a new player to Regenerate. Whether I want to switch up any of those is questionable. I think I could probably take out the Slith Bloodletter and possibly do a Reassembling Skeleton or a Drudge Skeletons to introduce sort of Regenerate, have sort of a different sort of blocker. That might be something that I would consider for this newbie deck. But I definitely kind of want to encourage new players to attack, because new players do have a tendency to sort of sit back and relax, and if Slith Bloodletter does deal combat damage to a player, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So new players it'll encourage new players to attack in the early turns when maybe the other opponent does not have creatures, or perhaps you've used a removal to get that extra counter on Slith Bloodletter. At 3 mana, we have 2 forms of evasion, 4 creatures. We have the Severed Legion with Fear 2/2 and a conditional 2/1 flyer that does something else, but it's very conditional. I do want a card that basically shows a new player's sort of conditional, like why some cards that you think might be good are not good because they are conditional, and sometimes they turn out to be that conditional cards can be very good. Another card that I might be able to use to demonstrate this would be a removal spell that removes either black or green creatures. But I want something a little bit more versatile. I don't want simply a dead card in the player's hand if he's not playing against green or white. But I'm going to go ahead and switch out one of the Severed Legions with the new add, the Blind Zealot, because Fear is an old keyword. Intimidate is the new keyword that basically says the same thing. Cannot be blocked by except for by artifacts and creatures that share a color, so black and artifacts. And it also gives the new player a choice for additional removal. When Blind Zealot deals combat damage to player, he may sacrifice it and destroy target creature that player controls. So it gives the Black Newbie deck another source of possible removal and also presents a choice. Phyrexian Broodlings this is an older deck. It was in there to sort of take advantage of damage on the stack effects, so that you would do damage with a small creature and then sacrifice it to put a token or +1/+1 counter on Phyrexian Broodlings. But since then, it's not as pivotal. But it's still probably an okay add in the sense that if somebody were to chump block and that creature's already going to die, they could, as a combat trick, pay one, sacrifice that creature, make Phyrexian Broodlings one larger, and potentially kill a 3/3. So there's still combat tricks to be had for Phyrexian Broodlings, so I'm going to go ahead and keep that in there. The next card that we see coming up is Gravedigger. A very classic card, been around a long time. When it comes into play, it comes onto the battlefield, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. It's 2/2. There's another enter the battlefield effect with Highway Robber. It comes into play. You gain 2 life, opponent loses 2 life. But I'm going to go ahead and switch out one of the Gravediggers. I'm going to make the Black Newbie deck just a little bit better. I'm going to switch out one of the Gravediggers with the new Entomber Exarch, because it basically, for 4 mana, does the same thing. You get to return target creature card from your graveyard in hand, or it presents, what if you don't have any creatures in your graveyard? It presents an additional option. You can look through an opponent's hand and choose a non-creature card from it, and that player discards a card. So hopefully it will kind of teach some of the pros and cons of discard. You might search that player's hand and find out that they have nothing but creatures, so that would be a con of discard. Meanwhile, it doesn't necessarily penalize you for waiting like Gravedigger does. But I'll probably keep one Gravedigger just because it is important to know that sometimes you need to play the Gravedigger and, not get a creature in your card in your hand. Sometimes you just need to play the Gravedigger and to get the 2/2 body out there for chump and whatnot. Don't know whether I'll change Highway Robber out. We're getting to like the little bit more costly of the spells. Dungeon Shade is a 1/1 flyer pumper shade. That's partially in theme of the deck. Primeval Chandler's also pump, but it's a 3/3 body for 5, so it doesn't have to be pumped to just have a blocker on the field or an attacker on the field. But this pretty much encapsulates the theme of the deck with Wicked Akubas, Nantuko Shade, the Genji of the Fens, and the Dungeon Shade, and the Primeval Shambler. These are sort of the late game wins where you're going to try to get in through with one of these guys and pump them up with lots of damage due to the extraplanar lens. So that's sort of the idea of the Black Newbie deck. That's how the Black Newbie deck sort of wins. The Clockwork Vorak is a really bad ad, I have to admit. It's so clunky. It's actually a terrible card. But it has a couple of things that you want new players to learn, which is that basically if you put down a 4/4 for 5, you may not want to attack within the next turn, just because this one has a drawback for attacking and blocking. And also, you might want to wait until the very end of your turn, your opponent's turn, to tap and put a +1/+1 counter. So this is one of those effects where new players can learn to wait until the end of the opponent's turn to do the tap effect. In ping cards, there's plenty of cards that basically you really want to wait until your opponent's end step before you activate the creature's ability or the artifact's ability and do something with your mana or your resources. In other words, this guy can still block if you don't immediately tap him during your turn. In other words, if you tap him, he won't be used as a blocker. You really want to leave him open as a blocker and tap him at the end step of your opponent's turn, and that's why he's in this deck try to teach new players that, and also has keyword trample, which is a different form of evasion. Simply the trample plus the howl from beyond could be the win condition. So I don't really have an alternative add to Clockwork Vorak. I really wish I sort of did. But the trample with the attack block drawback and you wait till the end step of opponent to do the activated ability is sort of featured all on this card. It gives you another sort of perk to evasion with the possible Howl from Beyond trample effect. I just don't know how to get as much basically educational bang for your buck, except for with Clockwork Vorak. So that's why I'm probably not going to take him out of the deck. We have two at the really upper step. We're now at 5 mana. All these cards cost 5 mana. It's not the most aggressive mana curve. Extraplanar lands can ramp into these spells, which is what makes it partially viable. You wouldn't want to have this deck really without some sort of way to get these spells out earlier, faster, easier. We have two creatures with evasion, the Arrogant Vampire, the 4/3 for 5. I'm going to go ahead and upgrade this guy to a Singer Vampire, mostly because I got the Singer Vampire, and I can now pull out the Ingert Vampire and use him as an EDH deck. Just have a vampire EDH deck. I just need creatures with different names that have vampires. So he's a 4/3 for flyer. So I'm going to go ahead and put a 4/4 for 5 flyer. And of course it has a classic Singer Vampire's ability that never seems to work, which is that if a creature dealt damage by Singer Vampire dies, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Singer Vampire. Never seems to really work out very well. And then of course the old school Nightmare, where Nightmare has a power and toughness equal to the number of swamps its controller controls. Older card, a little bit harder to read. But it costs 6, and Nightmare can be a real powerhouse if you have, 6 to 9 swamps. 6/6 to 9/9 flyer is nothing to bat your eyelashes at. That's a pretty decent play. So this deck construction went on a little bit long. I apologize for that, but this deck I specifically didn't really build it to be great or just a killer deck. What I did do is sort of built it for newer players who I'm trying to teach the game and when to pump for mana, possibly when to play a spell instead. Do a couple of combat tricks. Of course, enter the battlefield effects. The combat tricks possible with Phyrexian Broodlings. The choices that you have to make between Gravedigger, 2/2 body, or I'm going to do the Entomber Exarch to add a little bit more decision making skills. So this is kind of what this deck is set up to do, is kind of like give new players a lot of choices so that they have to sort of work through the puzzles to figure out what would be their most efficient play. And so thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this deck tech, and if you liked it, please like, and I hope to see you and talk to you later. Bye bye.